So you could be asking yourself, what are these videos about? And I hope that this is the first in a series of videos in which I explore the classical influences on the Warhammer games. They will cover a range of related topics from literature, art, history, and even videos such as this, which essentially focused on linguistics. I'm by no means a world expert on these types of subjects, but I've been studying these types of related subjects for about the past 15 years off and on at university, and in particular ancient history is a very strong passion of mine. And I have over 3 years studying with Latin and a little bit of ancient Greek and other languages as well. So this video is about the word demon and its alternative spelling that many of us have encountered in Warhammer, and that is spelled D-A-E-M-O-N. For simplicity's sake, I've divided the topic into a few different videos that will cover the subject differently, just so that it's not one huge, very lengthy video. And so the first we'll discuss demon in a very basic sense, and that is as it's used for the spelling and pronunciation, and why Games Workshop decided to use demon spelled A-E-M-O-N. The second will discuss demon from a linguistic and cultural perspective in a historical sense, looking at how the word is used in Roman and Greek society. And what I find really interesting about that is that it can actually be used in a positive manner. And I think that that's interesting because of the lizardmen and how they are now considered to be demons that are on the side of good and order. So finally, I think I'll be making a video about the more conventional kind of Christian perspective demon that kind of looks at that aspect. So I suspect that I'll be making another video next weekend. The third might take a little bit longer. We'll see. So we are probably all aware that there are two spellings of the word demon that are being used. One is D-E-M-O-N and the second D-A-E-M-O-N. The first is far more common. The second is what you see in Warhammer. As this is a Warhammer related video, that's probably where most of us are encountering that. I was also asked about a spelling of D-E-A-M-O-N. As far as I can tell, that's a misspelling. Because if you really search for that, you're not going to find anything too substantial. So that would be kind of my guess. If you want the short and sweet answer, the first spelling without the A is the more conventional modern spelling. And the second is more antiquated. It's used in more historical texts, and that's largely because it is direct and original Latin. So if you go back, to Roman texts that use that word, it will be spelled as A-E-M-O-N. And in some historical texts, like throughout European history, it will also be spelled that way as well. There are many English derivatives of Latin, but it is somewhat rare to see a pure, unaltered Latin word being used actively in English. One word that always comes to my mind is agenda. And what I love about that word is that it's Latin, and it absolutely retains its grammatical meaning in Latin as it's used in English. And I think that that's always interesting. But I would suspect that the spelling of D-A-E-M-O-N has remained largely intact and is still with us today because of its inherent religious connection. So obviously the biggest difference between these two is that the A has been dropped, and that's basically the short and sweet version of it. So how did this happen? How did the A drop from demon? Well, languages actually change very frequently, and there are a lot of historical variations in how words are spelled. If you trace the history of a word, it can be fairly complex. And English has a lot of challenges because it's essentially a German language with a fairly significant infusion of Latin and Greek. Vowels in particular are a little bit more fluid, and they can change fairly rapidly. And they are very frequently dropped from words. You can just look at, for instance, modern contractions are probably a good example of that type of process. And, modern contractions are interesting because in broader society, they're perfectly fine. In academics, they're not. And so what I would say is that there's a formalization in education that began, a couple hundred years ago and still exists today. So when you go to school, you learn a very specific, this is how it's being taught, and you learn that. But there's no real way of doing it in many ways. There are many different spellings of words, and some in fact coexist. For instance, the American education system really went for versions that were more simplistic. So if there was a vowel that they thought was not really that useful, they tended to drop it. The British and European education systems were a little bit more traditional and tended to keep that. And so that's where you see a lot of the variation take place. But you can even see how languages change over the course of a couple decades. English, even with a fairly formal and traditional education system, has changed, fairly significantly over the course of 100 or 200 years. And so if you magnify that by a factor of 10, you can see where massive changes can take place. So there's actually a lot of variation in language. And although there was an effort to formalize and uniform an education system, that still is really an ongoing process. But one of the impacts of that effort in the United States was that you have a distinctive, Americans refer to it as American English compared to the UK. And although it's somewhat rare to find two spellings of the same word coexisting at the same time, it does happen in other contexts, depending on what English-speaking country you might reside. As a Canadian, I'm reminded of examples such as honor or color, that the way I was taught is taught to add in the extra U. But of course, in the United States, that's not the case. And, just on a personal note, that was always kind of annoying because you get penalized in Canada for not having the U if you use an American word processor. And then I moved to the United States and you get penalized, if you add it in. But there is also variation in pronunciation too, and I'll kind of get to that. I was curious if demon, if spelt with an AE, was a little bit more used in the UK than it is in the United States. I think that's really difficult to tell, largely because of the influence of American culture on the UK in terms of books and television. But I would probably tend to say that might be the case. I asked a few friends in the UK, and they said that both are used fairly equally. So that makes me... But, with regard to the spelling of honor and color and things like that, we see that in the US as well, especially if you play Warhammer, because, of course, the books are all produced in Great Britain, and so they all have the UK spelling. So there can be a lot of variation in pronunciation as well. And I'm sure we've all heard people pronounce demon as spelled Daemon as Daemon. And it's usually quite amusing. And if you look at the comments of the video or whatnot, you'll see people commenting that it should be pronounced as demon. Now, if you look in a dictionary, and as far as I know, this is universal, they will stipulate that both spellings should be pronounced as demon. In other words, that the A should not be pronounced. Now, this is confusing because it breaks the formal rules of the English language as it's taught. And in many, many cases, you do see that AE vowel combination pronounced as A in English. But according to the rules of English, when you have those two vowels together, the first is pronounced long and the second is not. Or rather, it's absent. You do not pronunciate it. So, for example, in words like pain or eat or boat, you pronounce the very first vowel and not the second. But in English, demon, spelled D-A-E, ignores that, and it should always be pronounced as demon, without really exception. Now, what I find interesting about that is that it's even divorced from the way that it should be pronounced in Latin, even though it is a Latin word. So in Latin, the AE is combined into one sound, and that is I, or AI, as in the word isle. So if you want to act like a true High Gothic officer of the Imperium, and you're speaking in High Gothic and you want to be above those plebs, that's the type of pronunciation that you need to imitate. So this is a Warhammer channel, and I do want to tie this issue back into Warhammer. And we all know that the word demon, spelled D-A-E-M-O-N, is the universal spelling for Games Workshop and anything related to chaos. Now, this is all speculation, of course, because I haven't had any opportunity to conduct an interview or inquire. But looking back at my books, I've been able to kind of figure out roughly when that transition occurred. And because it's a transition, I would argue that it is a deliberate choice on the part of the game and fluffed designers of Games Workshop. So if you look at the early models that Games Workshop produced, many of them are fairly generic models. The fluff and lore of Warhammer Fantasy was slowly developing, but it was not yet unique, and 40K didn't exist at that point. If you look back at the models, a lot of them are fairly generic, because the concept of chaos wasn't quite developed at that time. So if you look at something that would be like a proto version of a bloodthirster, that is a large bestial demon with wings, a whip, and a weapon, I think the earliest versions are all labeled as a Balrog, as in Lord of the Rings. And all the lesser demons are really not too existent. Right, so this was a period when Games Workshop largely made models for its own games, but also for other games as well. And there are examples of early Chaos Warriors, but the specifics that distinguish Chaos Warriors today, whether they're Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, things like that, those weren't really well developed at all. So by the late 1980s, Games Workshop was developing its IP, and there's a clear divide there. So when you read the Warhammer Fantasy Rulebook in 1987, this is really the book where fantasy lore starts to develop and become really uniquely Warhammer. The world as it was is being flushed out, and in that book, demons are spelled D-E-M-O-N, the conventional spelling. But 1987 is also the year in which 40K, or Rogue Trader, as it was then called, was first released. And in that book, chaos is not really discussed. It really only talks about Imperial and a few alien factions. So if you really want to know about chaos in Warhammer, who the gods are and how they operate, what specific demons exist, how does the warp operate, or what is the warp, the first books that GW designed or wrote to discuss those subjects are the Realm of Chaos books. These are 2 books, and they laid the foundation for chaos and Games Workshop's intellectual property on the subject. They're beautiful books. The first, Slaves to Darkness, was published in 1988, the year after the previous books I mentioned. And the second, far rarer book, The Lost and the Damned, was published in 1990. So, like the more recent Liber Chaotica series, these books combined fantasy and 40k into a single lore. So, on the one hand, it talks about how chaos operates in Warhammer Fantasy. In the next page, it will talk about the Eye of Terror and how that functions in 40k. More importantly to me, every reference to demons in those books is spelt Daemon. And that's probably, as far as I can tell, the first time that transition occurred. So there seems to have been a clear divide between 1987 and a year later in 1988, when Games Workshop was developing the Chaos intellectual property. And I would say that's a very deliberate decision on the part of Games Workshop to specifically choose the archaic and Latin version of the spelling. And you might ask yourself, why would they do that? Well, because it's archaic and exotic. I think that plays into the nature of chaos as being, always eternally there, as being this ancient enemy. And it distinguishes itself through its unique spelling from the conventional use of demon in broader society. That is, of course, they're both in some sense a religious understanding of these, spiritual beings, but demons in Warhammer are very distinctly different from, say, demons in modern religion. I would also argue that because it comes out very shortly after the development of 40k, the release of Rogue Trader, that gothic feel of 40k and the fact that 40k uses a lot of Latin, that was probably a deliberate choice to use the Latin spelling. I think it's cool. I really like it, but it does create a lot of confusion for many gamers, which it's fine. I think it's always amusing. So that is the end of this video. The second upcoming video will discuss the meaning of the word demon from the classical Greek and Roman context. And what I'm going to talk about in that one will be how Romans and Greeks use the term demon, not necessarily in a negative sense. And I think that's interesting because of what Games Workshop has done with the Lizardmen, as making them good demons. So we'll talk about that in the next video. Appreciate you guys tuning in, and have a good one.